everybody, welcome back to Shannon's Lumber Industry Update. Today's episode 87, and I'm focusing on reclaimed wood. But first, as always, let me say thank you to those who sponsor and support the show by going to patreon.com/lumberupdate and becoming a patron. I sincerely appreciate that. As always, folks, keep your questions coming, keep your topic suggestions coming. That's what shapes the direction this show takes. So go to lumberupdate.com. You can fill out the contact form, or you can just email me directly at lumberupdate@gmail.com. And actually, while you're over at lumberupdate.com, you'll see over in the sidebar, there's a little thing there that says improve your lumber buying, or just go to lumberupdate.com/buying-lumber, and you'll find a little opportunity in there to download a lesson I put together on how to go about building your lumber shopping list. We all can do takeoffs and generate a number of board feet and go to the lumberyard and say, I need 40 board feet or 400 board feet. But more often than not, that's not sufficient anymore. We need more than just a volume. We need more than that board foot number. We need to have an actual lumber shopping list. So this is a lesson I put together actually in the hand tool school that talks about building a lumber shopping list. And, well, I'm giving it away. So go to lumberupdate.com/buying-lumber and you can check that out. All right, let's talk about some reclaimed wood. I've mentioned in the past, but never really gone into great detail. And honestly, I don't have a huge amount of experience with it, which is why I have two guests on the show today. Representing SawKill Lumber in Brooklyn, New York, with a millwork house in Windsor, Connecticut, or East Windsor, Connecticut, I have Alan Solomon and Klaas Armster here, who are, well, they wrote the book on reclaimed lumber. They are experts in reclaimed lumber, experts to the point that they've actually written the book. I think it's called Reclaimed, isn't it? The book? Yeah.
Reclaimed Wood, yeah.
Reclaimed Wood, yeah. I currently have a copy of it winging its way to me. I know you offered to send me one, but it was only $13. I bought it. It's the least I could do. I bought the book. So looks particularly interesting. I love the cover. But these gentlemen are experts in reclaimed lumber. And Alan works out of SawKill's Brooklyn lumber yard, and Klaas, I believe, is out in Windsor, Connecticut at the millwork facility. So we've got kind of two perspectives here on reclaimed lumber. Alan, why don't you tell us a little bit about what it is you do day in and day out, and give me your origin story. Tell me about when the radioactive spider bit you and how you got into reclaimed lumber.
I guess I'll also say Klaus's yard, he runs a larger facility at Armster Reclaimed Lumber in upstate, so I guess we can get into that a little later. But enough. In terms of, but we did partner to start a outpost here in Brooklyn that we call SawKill. It's a Dutch word that means Sawmill Creek, and it was a site of an early sawmill in the 1630s on Manhattan Island that the Dutch built. Back when Manhattan was prime logging territory.
Yeah, sure.
But
I just know I drive up the Sawmill River Parkway every time I go to visit my in-laws in Maine. But that's further afield. That's across the Tappan Zee area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a SawKill upstate too, and so they were building sawmills, along the Hudson at different points, and they had advanced sawmill technology, I guess, for that 1600s era. But in terms of getting into reclaimed woods, I'd say I had two starts. The first was my father. He ran a scrapyard up in the Boston area that he inherited from his father. My brother manages it now. And when I was a kid, I used to work there on Saturdays. It was like the late 70s. And I guess along with another kid in the yard, we'd pull things out of the junk pile. Back then, a lot of really good stuff flowed into the scrap. Brass door knockers and novelty ashtrays, pewter bowls, toy molds, all sorts of stuff that I guess you'd see on eBay today. But we take it down to... There was an outdoor movie theater in Revere that we take it down, drive-in movie theater. And we'd sell this stuff, and sometimes we'd tell stories about this stuff and throw some knocks on it and so forth. But I feel like that kind of got me into this idea of kind of plucking things out of the scrap. But when I got to New York, I wasn't working in this industry, but someone hired me to do some research on an old building in Lower Manhattan. It was like the mid 90s. They owned a bar down there, and they were getting pressure from a developer to sort of move out of the building, but they had a 20-year lease. So it was the bar owner was looking for a way to kind of create some leverage to, I guess, negotiate out of the lease. And he asked me to do some historical research on the building. So I guess long story short, it was at 211 Pearl Street. If anyone knows Lower Manhattan, it's the oldest area of the city. And this building ended up turning up, being older than it was suspected. And it ended up being owned by the founder of the Colgate-Palmolive company.
Wow.
And so it had these layers of history, and it was presented to the Landmarks Commission, and they went back and forth with the developer over a while, and there was a little campaign to, recognize the building. It was sort of a surviving warehouse style of the era, and there was nothing quite like it down there. So they came to a compromise to gut the interior of the building and save the facade. And in doing that, this sort of strange symbol came up on the interior wall of the building that kind of made the backstory of it, that much more compelling. So things were stopped for a little while, and then as they do in New York, development rolled on. As they were gutting the building, I went down there. I guess this was about 2000, and they were pounding most of the building into these 30-yard containers, trash containers, and the scrap metal was, of course, being salvaged. But then I saw people, loading these beams onto a trailer by hand, and I sort of did a little bit of a double take because I'd never realized this lumber was salvaged. And it was that point, I realized they were saving the wood, and, I didn't know where it was going, but I was really, curious about, where this material was going,
Sure.
after it had been in this building for 180 years. And at that time, there really wasn't, I'd never heard the word reclaimed wood. I don't even know if it was a term at that point quite yet. It had been used for quite some time, especially up here in New York for heavy construction applications, lining sewers and construction lagging and concrete forms and so forth. But, this old antique wood was, kind of, it was popular down south and in the Midwest in certain areas. But up here, it was kind of utility construction grade. So I ended up tracking down the lumber to a yard in Brooklyn and visited there, and so one thing led to the other. I shared the history with the owner of the company, and they had reclaimed lumber and new lumber, and they'd been around since the 1930s. And he asked me to sort of come do some marketing there. So that sort of started my first steps in getting into this material.
Sure, it's kind of interesting because you came to it from a very historical background, which I think is kind of key. I mean, that's one of the call it marketing things about this whole genre of lumber is connecting that story, connecting that history to the actual board in front of you. So kind of a neat intro, a very organic entry into this niche of the lumber business. Very cool.
Yeah.
How about you, Klaus? Let's hear your origin story. And yes, Armster Reclaimed Wood, I believe, is the official name of your company up there. So I appreciate you bringing that up, Alan.
Yeah.
That's correct. Yeah. So Armster Reclaimed Lumber. That's right. And I started the business in 2002 or thereabouts, 2002, 2003. But before that, I had actually done, I actually went to school for economics. And after college, I did some economic consulting. And then after that, I went and I helped my parents who had a small wood business. And I had a lot of confidence. I was like, I'm just going to help them out. They've really struggled. So I'm just going to get their business in order. And they process a lot of white cedar and cypress, predominantly for exterior applications. My father was an architect, and he used the wood initially, beginning in the 70s, white cedar in particular, after speaking with a forestry professor who had said, you like to use wood to clad your buildings, instead of buying Western red cedar, there's a local cedar and you should look into it, and it's white cedar. And so he did that. And running and working at that business, I just really got into wood and just milling it, processing it, understanding it and whatnot. And I was interested in how, different woods become sort of mainstream and what people look for. And I actually founded a company initially called Wood Planet, and it was like to buy and sell lumber online. It was sort of during the .com boom. It actually still exists. My wife runs it. But in that process, I did a tremendous amount of research. I read, some books like Buying and Selling Hardwood Lumber, Buying and Selling Softwood Lumber by Dave Leckie. And I joined the NHLA. I went to the NHLA conventions. I spoke to a lot of companies, a lot of presidents and personnel within a lot of major hardwood lumber companies at that point. And and I learned sort of a lot of the differences between how hardwood lumber and softwood lumber is bought and sold in the marketplace. And somewhere along the line, that company didn't really take off, but I had sort of remembered working with my parents' company. And somewhere along the line, I had an opportunity to source some reclaimed tank redwood, and I got some of this material, and I was like, wow, this is amazing. And I talked to some, and I didn't know that much about wood at that point, other than more what I'd read. I did a lot of milling at my parents' facility, but getting in and seeing that material and how special it was, I actually came into it, from the standpoint of, wow, this is wood that you just can't get anymore. And, I found out about chestnut and it being extinct and, or more or less extinct. And at least from a commercial lumber standpoint, certainly extinct. And heart pine and how it's different from some modern day, southern yellow pine. And even though it is the sort of original southern yellow pine, and I sort of got into it thinking, wow, these really special woods are actually still available. And there's a few ironies there, but one of which is, as we got into more and more into reclaimed lumber, it's become sort of apparent, over all these years, that it's like getting that really super special wood can be really useful and can be important. But a lot of times people are after, the wood with the holes and the bugs and just sort of really gnarly looking stuff. But we can kind of get into that. But after getting into that, I got into a couple projects. Lead building was kind of becoming big right about that time, and people were looking for reclaimed or sustainable sources of wood to chase their points for their projects, to get platinum certified or gold certified or whatever. So we started supplying some of those projects, and I think for me along the way, I had sort of worked in my parents' business, and sort of the broader lumber industry it's sort of somewhat easy to sort of understand. I mean, I will say, from the standpoint of having a wood company, in general, wood companies are not the most profitable businesses. Like, you look at some companies and they are building, tremendous factories and building buildings according to their specifications. And meanwhile, you see most wood companies and they're like hermit crabs. They're like trying to find some old discarded shell for them to set up their business in. And it's like, oh yeah, I can make my business work in this tiny little hovel, and we can get some power in here and produce something. So it's not the most profitable industry around. I think I remember looking when I was, setting up Wood Planet initially, I looked at all the NAICS codes and, for all the different industries, and there's like 160 sort of primary categories. And like at the very bottom of the list in the last 10, like in the top 10, there might've been like, oil companies and pharmaceuticals and things like that, and maybe tech companies, whatever. But in the bottom 10, it was like logging companies, millwork manufacturers. It's like, oh, these are the 10 least profitable industries you can get into. Why don't I jump right in? So we're like all these hermit crabs and whatnot. But I got into it, and I was really fascinated with the wood. But I think as I was sort of setting up the business, one of the first orders I did, I had to source all this chestnut, and I was used to buying, and operating within this sort of like mainstream of, if you need to make 1,000 square feet of flooring, well, you buy, 1,200 board feet of material or 1,400 board feet, and you can sort of, estimate your waste based on, certain things. But when you get into reclaimed lumber, I bought like 2,000 feet of chestnut, and I thought, okay, well, I'm going to make 1,500 square feet, and I processed all the material, and I made like 200 square feet of flooring out of it. It was like, the wood, it was all rotted, and there was some wood in there. It wasn't the right species. It wasn't actually chestnut. They had wanted a specific width, and, I sort of based on the size of the beams, I thought I could do it, and it turned out to be a mess. And after that, I'm like, all right, well, I'll just go buy more material. I guess I learned my lesson. I need to buy some material. And I went out and I literally bought wood from like 5 different suppliers. And every one of them was a dirt bag. Everyone, like one of them, it was like the wood was just so riddled with nails, it couldn't possibly be processed. Another one, it wasn't even the right species. Another guy sent him money. I never got any wood. He just disappeared. And I was like, man, I was used to buying wood. And it's like, when you buy like wood from a commercial mill, it's like, if you have a problem with that wood, like maybe they didn't dry it properly, and maybe it wasn't totally dry, or maybe you have some other kind of issue with it. It's like you call them up and it's like, I had an issue with 5% of your material, or your tally was off by 3% or 5% or something. And it's like, the wood, in your select grade, I don't agree with the grading. There was, 15% of the boards don't meet the grade or whatever. You can sort of go over that. And it's like, the claim is going to be like on a $30,000 load, you might have like a claim of like $1,000 or $2,000 that you can argue with them. Meanwhile, you get into reclaimed lumber and it's like, yeah, I just bought a truckload of chestnut and there's not a single piece of chestnut on the truck. And so I ran into these problems, and I almost just got out of the business right then, because I will say, one of the differences between, reclaimed lumber and new lumber is sort of the players. So the people who are involved, they're much more sort of opportunistic. They're not typically—
That's the word I was going to use. Yeah.
Yeah, they're not typically unscrupulous. They're not looking to necessarily have a business relationship where they can sell wood to you multiple times and in the future. It's like, you know what, we got this barn, we took it down. Let's get as much out of this thing as we possibly can. They're not necessarily knowledgeable. Somebody said it was all chestnut, so I'm selling it as chestnut since that's the most valuable wood there is, whatever. So anyway, there was a lot of like challenges associated with that. And it was like, for me, having come from the relative calm of sort of, softwood, white cedar lumber and cypress, and dealing with regular mills and people who just seemed like you could do business with them. It was eye-opening and almost sort of pushed me away from it completely. But I managed to sort of stick with it and sort of grow the business. And along the way, became sort of opportunistic myself, not necessarily in a dishonest way. But one of the things that I noticed was you have a lot of reclaimed lumber out there, a lot of really fantastic material. you certainly have opportunistic people. But two things that I did sort of right off the bat was, with respect to buying that material that I needed to complete the order, I switched the way that I do business so that I tried not to buy what I need. Instead, I tried to buy value. And that's pretty much what I've done ever since then. So, people contact me with what they have. I don't really tend to look specifically for material anymore, but people come to me and they know that if I'm going to buy the material, I'm going to want a good value. I'm going to want to get it at a good price. So I'm not really out there because when you're out there buying for a specific project, especially in reclaimed lumber, first of all, you might not be able to find it because the wood just comes up, sporadically. Secondly, if you can find it, it might not be exactly what you sampled. And lastly, people are going to know you need it. And so they're going to charge accordingly and be opportunistic. So I'm buying value every month, every week, every year. And someone has something, I listen to what they want for it. And, maybe I'll throw out an offer, what I think it's worth, and they can take it or leave it. And if they leave it, I move on to the next one. But the other thing that we sort of, did as we sort of were sort of establishing the business is I looked at all the other companies, and we had done a lot of business at that point already with Rex Lumber Company. And I looked at how these companies sort of operated, and really impressed with the organization, the operation, all sorts of components of it. And I looked at sort of what they, I asked them, some of these companies, around here, a lot of the wholesalers, all of them, they're, Kiever Willard and Holton Bugby and Rex Lumber and Downs and Reeder at the time, and all the McIlvains and whatnot. So, you have these companies, and so you kind of I was trying to sort of understand what they thought of reclaimed lumber and sort of what I could do. And the two things that came out of it was I realized that it was a niche that they weren't super enthusiastic about, and they weren't about to sort of jump in and start, competing with me, because they hated every aspect of it. They hated.
I'm so glad you said that.
I mean, they hated the bugs. They hated the nails. They hated the people who were selling them the wood. They hated. They probably hated the people who were buying the wood too. I don't really know, but just every aspect of it was just complete anathema to them. And so
it's almost insulting. If I can speak for those people, because I work for them, it's almost insulting. The level of detail and the amount of time spent in buying quality wood, sourcing quality wood, establishing sustainable relationships to provide consistent supply chain that is also environmentally sustainable and legal and all that stuff, grading, milling, drying, all of the quality control. Mm-hmm. You as the reclaim industry, you basically just thumb your nose at that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was listening to your podcast a few weeks ago, a couple things, and I was like, man, I'm going to say some things here that, will sound foreign to this guy. Cause you were talking about like, oh, we had wood with bugs in it. We had to quarantine it off into the side of our mill, and, we had to, heat treat it and stuff like that. I mean, I regularly am bringing in loads and loads of wood, and it's like, oh, look at all the, this wood's got tons of bugs in it. And it's like, well,
that wood is actually moving. Yeah.
Just throw it in right next to that reclaimed, perfect teak that we got. Who cares? It doesn't really matter, So it is interesting. Yeah, the wood is moving. Yeah, it's splitting itself up into in components. It's being digested and whatnot right in front of us. But so I sort of saw these companies. I was like, well, you know what? The demand doesn't appear to be going away. There's still architects, designers, people who want this wood, and for good reason. I can kind of get into that. But here you have all of these companies who just hate it, and right down to the mill workers themselves who are like, I don't want to bring that, I mean, they use nasty terms, but that I don't want to bring that garbage into my facility with the nails in it and the bugs and everything else. And it's insulting to them. Mm-hmm. And they were taking every opportunity they could when people were saying, "Oh, we want reclaimed wood for this millwork project we're doing." They were doing everything they could to try and make new wood look old and try to fake it and, whip it with chains and put nails in it, use little awls in it, whatever they could to kind of make it look like it had bug damage and reclaimed and use the original face and stuff. But the reality of reclaimed lumber is, why people like it is they like the authenticity, they like the history, they like the stories. But, when you're buying new wood, and I don't want to, denigrate sort of buying new wood, but a lot of it from a designer standpoint, when they're considering what they should buy, a lot of times it really comes down to what color is the wood, and it's like, because there's not a lot of textural considerations. Most wood is planed. I mean, there are some occasional textural considerations, but, historically, 99% of all millwork applications, the wood is planed. There's not a lot when it comes to, the grain is maybe somewhat important, or they might think it is. But why do you think there's this like interest in like all this white oak being marketed, as you had in another podcast of yours, as like sea mist gray or some sort of like forest green or whatever?
Yeah, it's all color swatches.
It's all color swatches. So new wood, and historically, the only new wood you could buy was, FAS lumber. So you're buying the best grade. So you're not having some of the natural characteristics in the wood. You're buying, and again, this is historically, it's not exactly the case now, but still largely. So you're buying the best grade. You're buying, you're buying planed, milled, cleaned up wood. And so it really comes down to maybe grain to a lesser extent, but mostly color. But when you get into reclaimed lumber, you have the history, you have all of these textural considerations. Is it rough sawn? Was it walked on by cows all these years? You have, the stains in it. Was it used as a wine tank or a pickle tank? Other textural considerations. You have the staining from the nail holes. All of these sorts of things that sort of come into play, which make it visually interesting and sometimes texturally interesting for the designers. So they see a lot there that they want to tap into when they're putting together their, restaurant, wall paneling or something like that. And so sometimes they're after that history. Oh, this came from the Coney Island Boardwalk. That's so cool. I used to go there when I was a kid. I loved the idea of putting that on there or telling that story. Sometimes it's, or age. It's, wow, this is wood from the, pit sawn in the 1700s or something. So you have a lot of these sort of textural considerations. You have the historical ones. You have the staining. This wood, why is this wood so brown? Well, it was at a horse farm and the horses pissed on it for 50 years. And, all of their, compounds in the urine, made it, fumed it basically. Oh, I didn't know that's how fuming is. Well, yeah, that's kind of what fuming is.
Basically, yeah. Stickly owned horses, so yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, but yeah, so I got into it. But what we did and the sort of the spin that we sort of took on it was, you know what, I'm going to try and emulate, Rex Lumber and some of these other, lumber companies, and try and offer the wood. So it doesn't matter what it looks like when it comes in, but when it goes out, I'm going to try and sell it to these companies in a way that they feel comfortable with. So it's going to be properly kiln dried. It's going to be remilled, remanufactured. So when they get it, because again, when the guys who I buy from, and if I ask them if it's dry, you ask a lumber mill if their wood is dry, and they will say yes. We put it in the kiln and we checked it. It was 6 to 8%, and of course it's dry. You don't even need to ask them, is it dry? Yes or no. That's it. But with reclaim guys, you say, is it dry? And they go, yep, absolutely. And what they mean by that. What they mean by that is, when we got it, we left it out in the rain for a couple months, but then we put it underneath the shed. So now it's been under the shed for a few months. It should be pretty dry now. Not even stickered. It
doesn't look wet.
So, yeah, and it's like, well, does it have bugs in it? Well, I didn't see any bugs, so no, I'm going to say no. And how about metal? Is it metal free? Yeah, we took all the nails we could see out of it. So, okay, great. And it just so happens that the ones you can't see are much harder to get out. But so there was this sort of concern. So I knew that presented an opportunity. If we can pull the metal out of the material, dry it properly, machine it, plane it if necessary, then we could get the material into the mainstream, and these companies would be willing to buy it. And that's one of the things that we've done. So we do sell a lot of wood even now to Kiever and Rex, and certainly a lot of our businesses to companies that are big mill workshops, and they know that if they're buying from us, they don't have to worry about those other issues, because it has become sort of more or less mainstream.
Sure. Well, I think you're filling a very needed niche, and I'm glad you said it before. The competition isn't really there, because I will speak for, when I say we, I will speak for the mainstream lumber industry. We don't want to mess with it. And it's, we joked about that kind of insulting side of things, but it's I think too difficult to run in parallel to deal with new wood and reclaimed wood. You almost have to have two separate operations. You need to have a separate staff to do it. It's so entirely different from a buying perspective, from just a curation of the collection. Like you said before, like, you buy on value, and because you can't really anticipate what that job, how much yield's going to come out of that job. So you're buying and you're stockpiling, you're maintaining an inventory, as are we, but it's a totally different situation where, the input is much closer to the output, at least from a rough lumber perspective. The mill side of things, totally different, and the guys that I've seen that do it well, they understand the eccentricities of this wood, but more importantly, they understand that this board is entirely different from the board next to it. That's something that a lot of millwork houses cannot wrap their head around. And it's what you said earlier. It's all that relatively plain grained stuff that makes good molding. Linear millwork, at least, not's bad. That 6-head molder will eat that board and spit it out in a little dust with that big old knot in the middle. So the traditional mill worker is used to, I've had to have some conversations about grain direction with guys in the mill, and they kind of look at me like, well, yeah, but it doesn't matter. Like, it comes out the same both ways. And yes, kind of, sort of. I mean, the good wood, you could run it through either direction, and the molders, especially with the cutter heads and things that they have now and set up properly, it almost doesn't make a difference. But when they do run it through in the right direction and you run your hand over it, they're like, oh, okay, now I feel the difference. But there's so many things like myself, I take off the lumberyard hat and put on the woodworker hat, the level of detail and all the stuff that I agonize over in building a piece of furniture. None of that exists in the commercial space. That's not profitable. And as you said, the margins are so ridiculously tight in the lumber industry, and not just lumber. I mean, lumber is a raw material. So talk to any raw material industry and the margins are ridiculously tight, because we are the guys that get the pushback. Like when you want to cut costs, when you're an architect or a contractor building a project and you want to cut costs, first thing you do is you go to your raw material supplier, drive down the cost of that steel, the cost of the concrete, the cost of the wood, et cetera. So, it's a tough business, and the more unusual, the more unique that running that job is, the less we're interested in it. So what you're doing is, for lack of a better term, standardizing all that crazy stuff that happens from one board to the next. You guys are qualified and able to deal with that, and the product you're producing is a little bit more standardized, a little bit user friendly, to those of us that can't deal with that. And I think that is a much needed position in the industry. It has to be there, or the whole reclaim thing is just gonna die. Because your experience with the people you buy from, that's what most people understand. Like in the lumber industry, architects, contractors, builders, all these guys that are using the material, when you say reclaimed and they all roll their eyes because they've all dabbled in it because it's hot, right? It's been super hot. Well, I'm going to, I'll dig into this, and oh my gosh, that stuff's expensive. So let's go to the guy who has the barn. It's much cheaper over there. Well, there's a reason, You get what you pay for. So in order for this aesthetic, just call it, design form, whatever, to continue, your business has to exist personally.
Right.
And that's speaking from, the marketing director of a large national lumber company. We don't want to deal with it, but we certainly have customers who want it. So we need you. We need you there
Right.
to help us out. And so let me just say thank you from the lumber industry perspective. It's very cool. And frankly, from a woodworker's perspective, because reclaimed lumber, and we'll start to get into kind of some of its sources, because I want to kind of define what we mean by all this, because reclaimed lumber has become so hot that now it's not reclaimed lumber anymore. And you started to hint at this with the scratch all marks and the chains and the texturizing machines. And I mean, you can buy reclaimed lumber at Home Depot and Lowe's, for God's sake.
Right.
And it's laminated together panels that have a gray stain on them, or some sort of oxidizing finish. I mean, the industry that exists around oxidizing finishes in order to get a prematurely weathered board, the fact that industry exists ought to tell you something right there. So
yeah, the challenge is you're exactly right.
Yeah, it's nuts. So certainly the aesthetic is in demand. The uniqueness is there, which I love. I mean, as a woodworker, I get into the grain. I love that side of things. And it always shocks me when I talk to architects and designers. You'd said earlier, it's about color. Worse than that, it's about color in a tiny little sample swatch that they were given by a lumber yard that's in their design library. You go into any architecture firm and there's some sort of design library, and they have a sample board on the wall, or maybe they have a little, bead chain of wood samples, and that wood sample is a 3-inch long by 2-inch long square. That's a 1/4 inch thick. And of course, it is clear as can be.
Of course.
It is quarter sawn as can be. It's gorgeous because that's the sample wood. So they go and they design, we're going to have a feature wall in this house or in this corporate campus. And, this is, this quarter sawn white oak is beautiful. Let's use that. And you ship them a bunch and they're like, well, that board's browner than that one, or that one has streaks in it, or that one has a gum pocket or something. Cherry is the one that comes to mind. And they reject it. And it's like, but it's all FAS. Like, that's perfectly clear lumber. The understanding of the organic nature of wood has disappeared in many ways. And we have plastics. We have printers that can print flooring that looks like wood. And it's pretty damn good, actually. I mean, you can see where the patterns repeat, but I think only I see that. Only people like me really see that. No one else sees it. They see a walnut floor. I see a printed walnut floor, but that has become very common. So what I think is interesting about the reclaimed, we'll just call it industry, is it is the polar opposite and the other direction. And if nothing else, jamming mushroom wood in somebody's face and them going, oh, that's kind of cool, might be enough to normalize the fact that even FAS lumber is unique from one board to the other. And let's talk sustainability here. Maybe it doesn't have to be FAS. Maybe we can let more number one common go through the system. Maybe we can use more of the wood out there. And that's the other reason. Economically, the margins are so tight, it doesn't make any sense to sell number one common, let alone number two common. You can't make any money on that. So everything has to be FAS. And for that matter, apologies to NHLA, but FAS means nothing. FAS is not good enough, frankly. 83% clear with a 6x8 cutting. Sorry, that's not going to cut it.
And that's why you see, lumber companies, they still, I mean, you pick up the hardwood market report and you see they're still listing the NHLA grades to sell their material. They're still listing as FAS, but they add additional qualifying components. So, and they're also adding their own grades. So where you say, number one is good enough, or maybe even number two or whatever, well, they're often now listing rustic grades. And when you buy a rustic grade from them, I'm surprised at sometimes how much they charge for it, because I'm like, wow, this is their coals from their number two. This is just some stuff they're sorting out from their number two or whatever. But the reality is, yeah, they have done that value add. They have sorted it. It's supposedly, sound knots and knot splits all the way to the end of the board. So it's not based on clear cuttings. It's based instead on sort of how, sound the board is, how usable it is with those characteristics that are in there. But
therein lies the flaw. The NHLO grade is a cutting grade. It's not an appearance grade. It's not like FEQ or a lot of the European exotic grades that are actually appearance grades. And a lot of people don't understand that. This is the top grade.
Right. And they make some effort. Some of the companies will put in, the sapwood minimums. They'll put in, or they'll put in 100% heartwood for the walnut, or they'll put in their
90, 10, 80, 20, all that stuff.
Yeah. Or they'll put in, veneer quality or something like that. And so they upsell it. They do some things to sort of add value. But I would say, the thing for us that I would say is sort of, to sort of, jump away from that discussion a little bit, but sort of stay with it. We have what we try to do, or what we've had to do, as I was sort of mentioning, is as we sell to mainstream companies, the big millwork houses that are doing big commercial projects, or, some of these lumber wholesalers or whomever, we have had to become sort of vertically integrated. So you take some lumber companies, like you were mentioning Rosenzweig earlier, I think before the podcast. And, these companies, they can't even process material. They buy from one or two or maybe three different suppliers, and they, sell all over, but they do no manufacturing. It's like they have a very distinct sort of place in the marketplace. And that is, when you want, quality material and you're in this location, which happens to be New York City, well, there's not a lot of places to get it. So there you go. You go there and you get what you need. Whereas with us, we are we're like the logger, the transportation company, the millwork shop. We're the sorting, the dry kiln. We're the retail facility. We're even the installer in some instances. We make countertops and we'll actually install them. So we are one of the most vertically integrated companies. You see that to a lesser extent on the softwood side with a company like Weyerhaeuser, but on the hardwood side, you have all these links in the chain. And, your company, for instance, that you work for, and a lot of these companies, you talk to, the designers and sort of the end users, and they'll have no idea. They don't know who the sawmills are. They don't even know who the lumber distributors are. They don't really know. The only company they know is the flooring company who sold them the floor, or the very end of the chain. Whereas with Reclaimed Lumber, we can be the company that's going down and not usually tearing down a barn, but certainly going in and picking it up off the ground and then bringing it in and having to, saw up the beams, having to dry them. And so there is a lot that we've had to sort of undertake. And that's why when you say sort of like, it's really not, it has to be treated as a separate entity, and it would be hard for a company, the mainstream lumber companies, to sort of take it on, because there are so many different, points at which it's completely unique. You talk to a company,
it is a different skill
like
set.
Rex or McIlvain or whomever, and they would have to buy from different suppliers than they currently buy from. They would have to add all these additional capabilities with respect to the metal, with respect to the kiln drying. And so if a company like ours can come in and do some of that, or do all of that really, then we're in good shape. I will say, there are some issues even with Reclaimed Lumber selling to these companies, because one of the things that they demand is that they don't want to be competing with their suppliers. So early on, they were like, well, we can't buy from, Armster or SawKill, because if we're buying from these companies, they will be competing with us to the end user, and to the stair company or whatever. And we've had to take some precautions, and we've had to pay attention to some things. But basically, that has become a non-issue, I suppose, or almost a non-issue, simply because we're small enough where it doesn't seem to come up that often, I suppose. But there have been challenges along the way. Certainly, trying to get our material into the marketplace.
And
having to sort of continually add. I mean, we own a millwork shop now where we have winding molders and, straight line rip saws and modern equipment, a giant dust collection system. And we bought that 7 years ago because it was getting harder and harder for us to have these companies, outside companies, process our material. So we're a sawmill. I mean, we have our own sawmill, we have our own dry kilns, and now we have our own mill workshop. So we've had to add in all this stuff along the way, and we're our own sort of sales force. So I'm going in and to, architects and meeting with them and sort of talking about finishes and everything, because we kind of, like I said, we have to do a little bit of everything.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to think that's a direction that the industry is heading. This is a decision I know that in McIlvaine we made about 12 years ago, to vertically integrate, from a quality control perspective, and from an education perspective, because so many of the end users, as you said, they just don't know. They don't know where it comes from. They don't understand kind of the working properties. They don't understand what's available to them from a design perspective, or they've been told something's available, but yet they can't seem to find it. And in order to prevent us from putting out so many fires downstream, we just started getting involved earlier, and then we just started doing, say you might as well just do it yourself type thing. And it's becoming more common. I think the internet, the democratization of just the marketplace, has eliminated a lot of those concerns you talked about earlier, where, well, we can't do business with them because then we'll be competing with our customers. It's there to some extent, but the fact is that that's pretty common now. Everybody, and the breakdown of the wholesale idea, this idea that you can sell a whole truckload and have it make one stop, just doesn't really exist anymore. So that truck is now making 27 stops, and the margins were already tight to begin with. So what has happened is people have started selling to different aspects and adding value where they can. And I don't think wholesale actually really exists anymore in the lumber industry. Where it does exist, I don't imagine it will for much longer. Anyway. Alan, let's give Klaas' voice a rest here. I'm curious, since we've you've got that kind of historical background in New York City, let's talk a little bit about where some of this material has come from. We've already thrown out several terms. We've thrown out the idea of tank wood. I brought up mushroom wood at one point. Where is this stuff coming from? And can we categorize reclaimed lumber? Can we kind of put it in different buckets as products?
Yeah. Well, in the book we did, Klaas, which most of it sort of reflects a lot of Klaas's inventory. We identified maybe 5 broad categories of reclaimed wood, starting with old houses and apartment houses, barns, of course, which usually comes most readily to mind when people think about reclaimed wood, industrial buildings, which may be the largest volume source of reclaimed wood. Is some of these industrial buildings can easily generate factories, mills, warehouses,
larger beams, flooring, a lot of stuff like that, right?
Yeah, larger timbers, decking, all joists. A lot of hard pine comes out of warehouses from the late 1800s.
Unfortunately, dear listener, at this point in our recording, we had some kind of weird hiccup in the recording software that neither Alan, Klaas, nor myself noticed. So we continued to have a merry little conversation about the different types of reclaimed wood, and none of it got recorded. We remembered it. I realized it later and picked up the recording, and I'll conclude this episode with that. But rather than trying to re-record this, I have a copy of Alan and Klaas's book called Reclaimed Wood. And basically, we went through the couple of chapters on the types of reclaimed wood. So I will do my best to try to recount that here, maybe without the same eloquence as Alan, as he waxed philosophical and historical on us a little bit. But essentially, as he was saying before he got cut off, Old houses and apartment buildings was a major source. And really what we're talking about here is framing material, studs, 2x. But it was also the species, like the finer species, maybe that we used for paneling or frame and panel libraries and things like that, would oftentimes get grabbed up, because they knew this is walnut or this is mahogany or something like that, and they didn't really make it into circulation. Or moreover, those houses, those are still standing. They're not torn down because those were the aristocracy. It was the everyman's house that got torn down, and that is the framing material. So for the most part, it was relatively unassuming, but what makes it interesting to us now is that it's usually old growth material. So you look at, a stud from the 1800s or the 1900s and super, super tight growth rings as compared to the studs that are specifically grown to be studs now. So they were still a lot of softwoods and things like that, but they were old growth or maybe in some instances second growth. The one particular thing of note with old houses is chestnut. Chestnut was used, again, that was an everyman's lumber. It wasn't really a specialized lumber. It is now because the chestnut is all but extinct. So chestnut and wormy chestnut are some of the things that we come across the most often when it comes to reclaimed houses, old houses and apartment buildings. The next category is kind of the ubiquitous barn wood. It's really what almost the reclaimed wood movement was built around, because barns were everywhere. And what's interesting is barns were, they were built by the farmer right there on site. Often the trees cleared to make room for the barn were used to build the barn. Certainly there wasn't a lot of wholesale distribution going on to build that barn, so the trees were felled on the property and then repurposed into the barn. So oftentimes you'll find a mixture of species. Everything from oak, probably primarily, certainly chestnut at the time, depending when the barn was built, but beech, hickory, elm, maple, birch, and occasionally you'll find some oddball on there because it just happened to be one of the trees the farmer cleared to make that barn. Kind of the distinguishing factor here, though, is these were not, finished products. They would have hewn marks or circular saw marks on the side, and that's really what makes barnwood now, is all those mill marks. The old houses and apartment buildings, that was surfaced material because it was meant either as sheathing inside, or they were rough sawn studs, framing material. The barn really, like, the more texture, the more mill marks there are on it, like the more valuable it is as a reclaimed material. The interesting thing about barnwood, because it has become so popular and it's kind of the icon of the reclaimed industry, is it is waning quickly. The barns, that are, rather than being sitting abandoned like they were for decades, now people are taking them down immediately because they know they've got gold in their barns. And the reclaimed barnwood thing is actually becoming much more of a scarcity. So it's a true irony, and we think of reclaimed lumber as salvaging lumber from the past and repurposing material, and now what we're repurposing is actually starting to become rare because it has become so incredibly popular. The third category is from industrial buildings. And interestingly enough, we tend to think of barns as a great resource for larger timbers, but it ends up not being the case because and really they're coming from these industrial buildings. The barns used to get grabbed for siding, and a lot of times the timbers inside the barn themselves have either degraded too far or they're too difficult to get out of there. There's just too much going on because the barn obviously is an open air structure. So those larger timbers had oftentimes a lot more rot inside of them. Industrial buildings, on the other hand, well, they weren't meant to be open air buildings. They were factories filled with workers and things like that. In many instances, they were built post Civil War era during the Industrial Revolution boom that happened after the Civil War. These were big buildings, big timbers. So basically it was restricted to softwoods, the softwoods that grew big enough and tall enough and straight enough. So in the eastern United States, we were talking eastern white pine. In the south, you're talking southern yellow pine, loblolly pine, heart pine. And as you move further west, you're talking about Douglas fir. Enormous timbers, 8x8s, 12x8s, 12x12s, 40, 50-foot long things. And then, of course, you had quite a bit of flooring. and flooring that would stand up to a lot of abuse. So you would find maple flooring quite a bit throughout. This is everything from T&G flooring to just square-edged plank flooring, all the way down to that heart pine flooring, oftentimes in what today we would call 2x thickness, thicker than your traditional 3/4 inch hardwood flooring. But these industrial buildings is really where the good quality, larger, heavy timbers come from, and that's what kind of makes it its own separate, unique subcategory of reclaimed material. And the next category is the one that I felt particularly interesting, and I think from a small furniture maker, woodworker perspective, this is the gold mine. And these are the tank woods, the wooden tanks that you see on the top of large buildings in New York City or the Bronx or any major city, and also in large industrial applications. Wooden tanks were pretty low volume size tanks. Certainly there were some larger water tanks and things like that, but they're found in for housing specific liquids like wine or vinegar, vermouth, pickles, whiskey, beer, even Worcestershire sauce. They're really kind of everywhere too. And what makes them distinct is they are made out of species that resist water and rot. So your western red cedars, cypress, redwood, all the cedars really, and white oak. Of course, we know that today from the distilleries, the white oak is absolute gold. And certainly Douglas fir will come in there as well when it's not being used for large timbers. But what's interesting is these were, relatively thick planks that had bevel edges put together much like a cooper would build a bucket today. But they also take on the character of whatever was stored in them. So if it was a pickle tank, they smelled like pickles, and they would be stained and dyed based upon what was inside of them. And in many instances imbued with that. So all the moisture was taken out of this board and was completely replaced with vinegar over decades of storing vinegar. And likewise in the pickle tanks and the Worcestershire tanks. So you get unique staining, unique colors. You also get wearing on the boards that it gives you that texture, almost like shishugibon texture, where you burn the wood and then wire brush off the softer wood. The acids and things like the vinegar have eaten away that softer wood, giving you that 3D kind of topographical effect of the wood. But more importantly is the woods that were being used here, they wanted them to be completely free of knots, because obviously a knot would be a spot where things would leak. So they would often use straight grain, rift, quartered type materials in really beautiful tone woods. When you think of some of these softwoods, the Douglas firs, the pines, the cedars, spruce, Alaskan yellow, would make outstanding tone woods today. And there's a whole kind of subculture of the reclaim movement where the luthiers are seeking this type of stuff too. Really interesting. And if you go to Klaas's website, he's got some really cool pictures of some of the tank woods. Actually, for that matter, just buy their book, guys. Reclaim Wood is an outstanding resource. I'm looking through some of the pictures in here right now of the various stainings and textures happening to things like cypress for these tank woods. Very, very cool stuff. I know I'm going to be keeping an eye out for tank woods from here on out, because it's cool stuff. And then really the last category is kind of the catch-all, the uncommon stuff that shows up in any of the thousands of applications that wood was used for during the growth of this country and really around the world in the Industrial Revolution. So some examples here are boardwalks, docks, dunnage or cargo woods used in the holds of ships. Cherry was very common here. Bowling alleys, gym floors, another very common one, and all kinds of industrial processes like crane mats, steel mill rolling platforms, things like that. All of this stuff kind of filters in. And what's interesting about this last category is you'll also find a lot of recently reclaimed. Not all reclaimed lumber has to be hundreds of years old. Some of the stuff is from the 1950s. And when we look at steel mills, so many steel mills have closed down in the recent decades. And a lot of the reclaimed material coming out of that was recently sourced actually by the company I work for. I've actually had several pieces of wood come back and land on my desk that we sold in like 1912. and someone was reclaiming it, and they traced the sources back, and they traced it back to the J. Gibson McIlvaine Company, and they called us up and said, "Hey, you guys are still in business. How cool! Do you still have this material? Like, we're reclaiming this hard maple or this Douglas fir. This stuff was originally supplied by you guys, 110 years ago or something like that." It's really kind of interesting. We are now seeing that circle of life come back around again. So as I mentioned before, some of the reclaimed things like barnwood are starting to become more and more scarce. We can still continue to reclaim material that's being used in buildings today. It perish the thought of some of the quality of the stuff being used in framing material today, but there certainly is material out there that could be exotic. I know a lot of my customers using exotic material for ceilings and things like that. Well, in 60, 70 years or so, somebody may be reclaiming an Iroko ceiling or, a walnut paneled room or something like that. So this circle of life of reclaimed material continues on, but ultimately those are, what did I cover? Like 5, 6 different categories that you can find this material in. And different colors, different textures, different thicknesses, different widths, lengths, but oftentimes looking at those dimensions, you can get an idea of what that originally was used for and start to tell the story of that particular species of wood, that particular board, etc. And at this point, I will drop us back into our original recording because by now I figured out that I was a bonehead and wasn't recording anything. Having some understanding of what it is as a reclaim seller, reseller, retailer, millwork house, what are the things that you do to make the wood, for lack of a better term, acceptable? And I kept kind of going back on that because the answer is it depends. And this goes back to your idea of kind of wanting to take this reclaimed business and emulate what some of the other big companies were doing. And so many of the lumber entities that exist today are you kind of said it earlier, they're kind of just taking the order. Here's what I need. You need 1,000 feet. Great, 1,000 feet. Put it on the truck, ship it. And there needs to be more conversation on what are you making? What's the application? Or, and as you said earlier, you don't want to be insulting, but you're kind of like, are you sure you need that? Are you sure that's the right species for you? And I think there needs to be greater conversation, and this is up and down the chain, at the architect and design, interior design level, to the builder level, to the actual trim carpenter, to the person doing the takeoff, to the intern making the call, to the purchasing department. There needs to be more conversation to better utilize the resource, whether that's new wood or whether that's reclaimed wood, in order to keep reclaimed in the zeitgeist and have people wanting to use it and not rolling their eyes. There needs to be a better understanding of this is not regular lumber. This is not just go pull it off the shelf. This is not just put it on a truck and ship it out. This is lumber with an asterisk. This is lumber that, how do you want to use it? We will make sure that it is, prepared, for lack of a better term, in accordance with what kind of stresses you're going to put it on, what do you want it to look like, how you're going to use it, how you're going to install it, all that stuff. And because of that, all the way back to the beginning of our conversation where, Klaas, you bought, I can't remember the numbers, but we'll say 1,000 board feet, thinking I'll get, 500 out of it, and you ended up with 100, in order to close that gap, in order to stretch that finite resource further, having these conversations at every step of the design and build process will allow us to take that 1,000 feet of highly precious American chestnut and get a better yield and reduce the waste quotient.
I spoke to a architect this morning that asked for pre-loved lumber, which I honestly never heard before. So, whatever that means, there are architects, that are...
I'm not sure I want to know what that means.
But there are architects that do really like the tension between the old wood and whatever modern design they're working with in the space. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's fitting into a historical or traditional design, but as often, they like the element of having this material that is, got a backstory that's pre-loved, I guess, and
sure,
and incorporating it. But and oftentimes it's like a homeowner that has the most interest, and the architect is sort of pursuing the material at the request of a homeowner. And it's
the ultimate client.
And it's I think that person that has the firsthand experience that's going to be living with the woods, where maybe the story, may have the most value to their project. Agreed. And it's it's hard to put a value on that for them, but it's that whatever it is in the backstory. And for us, it's the backstory of an old building, which may have been around for 100 or more years, and then the tree itself, which may have been 300 years or more. Or we supply samples lately to a lab up at Columbia that does the dendrochronology on the woods, and that's another area that's really interested in these old timbers, because they can't get trees with rings that date back that long. With their analysis of the wood, that kind of adds another layer to the backstory of the wood, which
agreed,
which I guess makes a difference between what we were talking about, like recently reclaimed wood and antique wood. From an environmental standpoint, there's really no difference. You're theoretically, preventing felling new trees or keeping wood out of the landfill. The environmental impact of reclaimed wood, in the scheme of things, isn't really, doesn't really do a whole lot, which, maybe contribute to the...
It's not terribly significant.
Yeah, to some skepticism about the material, but, as a material...
Well, I know one of the things that I find particularly interesting, especially when we're talking industrially reclaimed, is I don't think a lot of people understood just how much of a role wood played in the Industrial Revolution and in manufacturing. We're so used to, modern manufacturing, and I'm talking the silicon age, clean rooms and steel and glass and all that stuff. And, the idea of these industrial factories that were entirely with wood, it's not just the floor they were walking on, but the machines, we talk about crane mats and steel mills and things like that. The amount of wood that was being used in the actual manufacturing process itself is really very unknown. Tank wood, that was a new one to me. You think tanks and you think, stainless steel. You go into any microbrewery and craft brewery and they have those big stainless steel distillery tanks, brewing tanks, fermentation tanks. That's the word I'm looking for. All the craft brewers out there are rolling their eyes at me. We don't think of them as being wood, other than like barrels for creating whiskey and wine and the actual tannin process that makes that possible. So it is very interesting, and it kind of gives people this insight into this amazing, magnificent, material, and how much of a role it actually played in the society that exists today. I'm certainly waxing philosophical here, but I think that the more understanding that we can have over that, and just what a role these woods played, I think the more people will stop balking at how much, how much does that cost? Right. This is a finite and unique material that we're looking at. So why don't we land this whole plane by tell us how people can find out more about you. Alan, why don't you go first?
I guess like most places, the website, we're at sawkill.nyc. And as you mentioned, we did a book a couple of years back that's available on, wherever books are sold, I guess, or they say.
Yeah, and there's information on your website about it as well. So it's a good place to go. How about you, Klaas? Give us the details.
Same here. We have a website, armster.com. We also have a Instagram, armster_reclaimed_lumber. And I think that's pretty much it. Other than that, you can give me a call and talk about reclaimed wood.
Apparently we can do that. Apparently we're pretty good at doing that right now as I look at the time on my my recording at this point. So, well, I mean, I could keep going. I've got a lot that I want to say, but I also recognize that we don't want this to be a 3-hour long podcast. So I will say, I think this is a to be continued conversation. I think more needs to be said about this. More people need to get excited about it again. It was really, really exciting, and then it started to die off, and it's kind of been in this undercurrent, becoming very, very niche. And I can see supply chain issues, whether COVID related or not, could possibly shine a light back on the reclaimed industry. The idea of all of the urban harvesting I've been talking about and the micro sawmills and a grassroots lumber industry, I think is also going to shine a light back on reclaimed lumber. Not that it's really been gone, but shine a brighter light. So I'm looking forward to seeing more of this showing up both in my personal work, but also professionally as well. So thank you to you both for taking so much time and really cluing in a guy that didn't know as much as he thought he did about reclaimed lumber.
Well, thank you, Shannon. Thanks for. Go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, there's always more to say, it seems, on all the podcasts. But, we covered a lot of ground, and we appreciate, your interest.
Yeah, and I would say thank you as well for giving us the opportunity to talk about it. And, it's been fun. And it is. It's something that I think you're right. It peaked a little bit, and then it's kind of come back down. But I think it has sort of found a little niche now where it seems to just keep moving along, and we'll keep doing our part. But yeah, thank you again for that. It's terrific to get.
Sure. And I specifically want to thank you for the authenticity of the running sawmill in the background. It's very faint, but if you know what to listen for.
Yeah, it's a straight line rip saw.
That adds a
absolutely. Oh.
Yeah. There's a certain amount of credibility to this conversation, and the fact that before we started this, I told Alan I do not record from the yard because all you will hear is forklift beeping noises all day long and whining molders screaming in the background.
Well, I told them that we couldn't operate the planer while I was doing it, but I thought the rip saw was a little quieter, so I thought we'd be okay. It's further away too, so anyway, I didn't know it was coming
get
through.
Away from those planers.
Anyway,
well, then I'll make Alan very happy when I close this podcast by saying, folks, go buy some reclaimed wood.
Yeah, that was a little tongue in cheek, but it was.
No, I like it. I like it. That was the subject line of our email exchange leading up to this.
Perfect.
Maybe you can say, go buy reclaimed wood. So.